Hello and welcome to the Irish History Boys with me, Cormac Moore.
And me, Tim McGarry. Yes, Cormac's from the south. We should get a cross-community grant, a cross-border grant for this.
And we'll check into that, yeah.
We are discussing the border yet again, but we're also discussing a bigger topic, internment. Internment in 1975 was still an issue. It was introduced in 1971, but in 75 it was still going.
It was still going. It was introduced to basically curb IRA violence, but it's arguably led to more IRA violence. And it continued on for over 4 years. It's a hugely controversial subject. But internment didn't just happen from 71 to 75. There's been a long history of internment.
That's what we're discussing. I didn't know there was internment after the 1916 Easter Rising. There was internment during the
War of Independence, during the Civil War,
during the Civil War,
during the Second World War, border campaign,
1956 to 62. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't.
If you want to find out more about it, listen to us on the Irish History Boys, wherever you get your podcasts. Sir, internment in any circumstances is immoral. As practised by Mr. Merlin Rees in Northern Ireland, it is not only immoral, but anti-Catholic as well. Consider the cases of the following 74 Catholic men and one Catholic girl who were still interned on April 1st, 1975. They have all served the equivalent of at least 3-year prison sentences, without a break. Some of them have done terms of 4 or 5 years with remission. These 75 internees, who have never been convicted, are legally innocent. Nevertheless, they have fared worse than many who were convicted of serious crimes in the courts. No Protestant internee has ever been held as long as any of the Catholics. The few remaining Protestant internees were recently released by the Secretary of State at the height of a campaign of assassination of Catholics. The only possible explanation for the disparity of treatment of the internees can be the anti-Catholicism of Mr. Rees.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Irish History Boys. I'm Tim McGarry and you heard the voice there of Dr. Cormac Moore. How are you, Cormac, today?
Very good, Tim.
Very good. You were beautifully read the letter from the Irish News from the 1st of April 1975, a letter from a Belfast-based priest called Father Brian J. Brady condemning the extreme anti-Catholic bias of the British government's internment policy. So we're going to be discussing internment in all its shapes and forms. In 1975, I've never heard of the Father Brian J. Brady. Apparently he was an associate of Father Dennis Fall, Father Raymond Murray, the late Raymond Murray, who just passed away recently, who were priests who were fairly heavily involved in the civil rights and in condemning excesses of what they saw as the excesses of the Northern Ireland state and the RUC and the British government. So this is one example of the policy of internment. Now, for those of you, internment was a big issue when I was a young man.
Do you remember internment?
Shut up. I don't. Well, people probably know I was born in 1964, so I was 7 years old when the latest phase of internment was introduced in 1971, the 9th of August 1971. And for many, many, many years afterwards, there used to be riots and wrecking the place on internment night. That was the origin, by the way, of the West Belfast Fela and Fobble. They started having cultural events in order to stop people rioting in August, and started playing.
And what was the first song, Man Behind the Wire, was it?
You stopped that. That
was actually...
we played the first... Well, that was
a song because of internment.
Well, of course it was. So, internment, for those who people go, what is internment? Internment is imprisonment without trial. It's basically rounding up people whom you suspect of doing bad things.
Or being a sympathiser.
Who suspect of doing bad things and putting them in jail, out of the way, without having to go through the trouble of proving something beyond a reasonable doubt. So this letter relates to the internment that was introduced in 1971 by the then Stormont government under Brian Faulkner, who introduced internment when the Troubles had broken out in 69. They'd got worse in 70, they got worse in 71. But after internment, the argument is they got absolutely far worse, and some people say that it was entirely counterproductive. So the Unionist government introduced internment in August 1971, basically as a tool against the IRA, isn't that right?
Yeah, well, it was Operation Demetrius was the name of the first phase of this in form of internment. It was kind of Brian Faulkner's last chance because the British government threatening, like, you don't have control, we're going to take over, this direct rule is going to come in if this doesn't work. It was kind of the last throw of the dice by Faulkner. Now the British were involved as well. Like they were obviously talking to Faulkner. He was having various different meetings with British government. There was a lot of support. There was some of the British Army didn't think it was going to work, and timing was important as well. When do you actually, because internment had been used as a British policy not just in Ireland but through many of his colonies as a tool.
Yeah, it wasn't a new tool.
It wasn't a new tool at all. Look at Easter Rising. There was thousands of people interned. Many of them had nothing to do with Easter Rising, and they were all sent off to Francoch, and which became their University of Revolution, and sent to other places in England.
I mean, again, it's something I only when I read up on it. There's a very good book by a man by the name of Fergal McGarry. No relation, by the way. No relation, sadly, on 1916. And I thought I knew about 1916.
Great book, and he's a great biography of Ona Duffy as well.
But the use of internment after the Easter 1916 Rising. Thousands of people were basically rounded up. It was called the Sinn Féin Rebellion. People who were rounded up had nothing to do with it. Were basically on the fringes of republicanism, or vaguely sympathetic, and this was a contributing factor to the fact that it turned people. A lot of people who were against the Easter Rising and the violence of Easter week in Dublin suddenly went, well, I'm being arrested by the Brits for absolutely no reason. It
wasn't just his executions. You're right. It wasn't his executions. It was also those people interned or imprisoned that did see that general sympathy kind of come about after the Rising, when there wasn't much during it. And it obviously wasn't a Sinn Féin rebellion either. But that's for another matter.
Before we get to the sort of the context, let's go back to 1971 and this man's letter in 1975. Father Brian Brady. Father Brian Brady is saying internment was introduced in August 71. The Provosts started their campaign in sort of 1970. They kind of formed the provisional wing of the Republican movement. Early 71, violence was escalating. There was a particularly gruesome incident where 3 teenage Scottish soldiers were killed
off duty,
and it caused shock and revulsion across Northern Ireland,
including with the community.
Because there were literally kids. There were 18, 19, 2 brothers, if I remember correctly. And it was a particularly vicious murder, but there was a lot of calls then from pressure on Brian Faulkner to introduce internment and said round up these people, round up the IRA, because we know who they are, is the argument all the time. We know who they are. So
they have good intelligence. That was what they were saying. So it was introduced in August 71. Based on that intel they had, the RUC Special Branch, RUCSB, they had big lists. The British Army did the dirty work, for want of a better term. They actually went in.
They did the actual arrests.
They went in, dead of night, and forced people out of their homes, and round up hundreds of people. And there was violence as well. Ballymurphy happens at this time. That there was innocent people killed. The British denied. Say that they were shot on first. We all know what happens afterwards. So it was the timing was terrible. It was seen as an attack on just the nationalist community, and it was. No loyalists were interned initially, and it was seen as brutal as well. The way they were brutally arrested, taken from their beds at the dead of night. There was violence. So it's pretty much the start of it basically meant how it was going to continue. And the Catholics were totally rejected. The nationalist community totally rejected the policy of internment. So it was meant to, and direct rule comes in anyway because it doesn't work. In fact, it actually makes people join the IRA.
Sorry, just to go back a wee bit, did the Provost know it was coming? Were they expecting it? Because they don't appear to have got. They probably got some Republicans, they got some activists, but they didn't get the top men. Because I remember there was a famous press conference, was there, with the IRA in West Belfast.
Joe Cahill,
basically saying, where the officers.
Which was, in fairness, a good propaganda idea. If you've interned the IRA, well, here I am, the chief of staff. But yeah, the IRA, it was a bit like in 1918 when the May plots. That if you watch the Michael Collins movie, which isn't great in fact, but it is an entertaining movie.
You're saying there were no car bombs in 1920?
But and there was no tanks going into the Croke Park.
Don't ruin it.
But there was one scene where they knew the German plot arrest was going to happen. that they're rounding up senior Sinn Féin figures to be interned. De Valera says, no, we'll stay in our beds and we'll get arrested, and the world opinion will go on our side. And Collins goes, oh no, I'm not going to get arrested as Harry Boland, and then they continue the war, on the ground. So it's similar to that in a lot of the IRA leadership were aware of the policy about to come in. They had informants in Stormont. And so many of them decided to get out of the way and not be at their home that night, and they weren't captured. But there were many people who were in the IRA who were captured. It wasn't a case of randomly just selecting any civilians. There were a lot of people in the IRA that were arrested.
Right.
So but the problem with the policy was that it was so unpopular. And it was seen as so like anti-Catholic, anti-nationalist that it actually led to a huge increase in membership of the IRA. So
it was completely counterproductive because violence had been steady and was increasing, but it literally went exponentially from August 71 to the end of the year, and then 72, of course, becomes the worst year of the Troubles.
Of course, it's all related to internment as well, isn't it? You got Ballymurphy, and then even Bloody Sunday, like that was a civil rights march, but the big political issue was internment.
Could it have succeeded if they'd done it right? Did they? Was it a failure of intelligence? Was it a failure of to get the right people at the right time? Could they have nipped the problems in the bud?
Who knows? It's what ifs. I don't know. But like you look at the border campaign of 56, 62, there was a lot of internment in it, and that wasn't that was seen as a success. So and also if they had started, say, after, Bloody Friday, well, maybe Bloody Friday wouldn't have happened if there was no internment, but say Bloody Friday in July in 72, if Donald Dinn, there was such revulsion but by within the nationalist community, throughout society, that it might have been more effective if it was very tailored, to specific people. It could have worked, but it was so badly done. It was targeted against one community and not the other when loyalists were committing violence as well, and they knew they were committing violence. And it was sporadic. There was a lot of people who had nothing to do with the IRA who were arrested and interned. So there was
Jake O'Kane, the comedian.
Was he?
No, he was not arrested. No, Jake O'Kane was not the comedian. Was not arrested. Right, okay. But no, bizarrely, his father was a councillor in Belfast City Council and was a Republican councillor. I can't remember what political party. He was the only elected representative to ever be interned. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. No.
He spent some time. No, I think he was released fairly quickly. And Jim O'Kane, I think was his name. I need to check my facts there. But no, genuinely, the only elected representative ever to be interned, and had nothing to do with violence. But was one of those people that kind of, so you're literally lifting councillors, rather than terrorists in inverted commas.
Well, yeah, but obviously most Republicans weren't that interested in electoral politics at that stage as well. So, but the reason why we're talking about 75 is because, it was started as a temporary measure to break the back of the IRA, to stop the violence, so the Stormont can continue, and it didn't work. And it's the British take over, but even though they had been part of internment from day one, but they take full control over internment from 72, and they keep at it. But they're more kind of specific, and they're more tailored, and it's they let people off, and then they have small little kind of periods, like Operation Motorman, for example, is more tailored, more specific to try and get Republican leadership. But it's still going on, and it's a massive political issue in 75. But 4 years later, and some people are interned for all this time.
So you're interned for years.
And people die in internment. Like, there was one guy who featured on this day a few months ago, and he had asthma, and the doctor said if he wasn't interned, he wouldn't have died because it was by the time he had a very serious asthma attack in the the Long Kesh, and by the time he got medical help, it was too late. Whereas if he had been at home or somewhere else, he had a much better chance of survival. So there was casualties to it. There was obviously a lot of riots. There was escape attempts and all of that. So it was a massive political issue, and it also like the University of Revolution for Ongok, it actually made young lads who were interned became more Republican, more committed to the cause. And they took up roles later.
Well, let me give you an alternative viewpoint. Among the internees, not in August 71, but slightly later, was a certain G. Adams. Who was interned. And in fact,
what about Jerry A?
He's taking a case against the British government for unlawful internment because the papers weren't signed correctly. They weren't signed by the Secretary of State. They were signed somebody underneath him, which is a kind of minor legal issue. But is there not an argument to say, well, look, they did get some of the right guys, and okay, there were a few people, on the side who maybe shouldn't have been arrested, but they were close to getting the right guys.
Yeah, but again, if they're going to do it for nationalists, why didn't they do it for loyalists until later in the day? They did it. They only started arresting loyalists, interning loyalists from 73, And even in 75, we're looking at a huge disproportionate number of nationalists being arrested, or Catholics being arrested and interned, like 2,000 to about 100, I think is the overall figures. And then you have this kind of, a lot of these sectarian murders start happening, of loyalists literally going after Catholics. And I think I think Father Dennis Fall actually talks about this murder triangle, which that becomes an issue. This triangle of murder. That kind of area around Dungannon, parts of Armagh, Tyrone, where the Glenannan gang, it's starting its trade as such, down this time, and nothing's happening to these loyalists. So there is always this unfair
perception
bias.
of bias.
But it's not even a perception.
Yeah, no,
it happened. Like there was a targeting for the IRA and for Catholics.
Yes, well, the first loyalists I think were interned in 73.
Yeah, February 73. I think.
And I think.
And the first woman actually was interned in January the 1st, 73.
Right.
Yeah.
So as a weapon in the Troubles, it was entirely counterproductive. It's got a rotten reputation now, because
But then you've got the hooded men as well. The sensory deprivation, the techniques used. Throwing them off the helicopter. They don't know how high the helicopter is. Depriving them of sleep. Putting hoods over them. That happened to 14 men. That was technique used to try and get information off them. This is part of the internment policy as well. So, so this is you're basically depriving people of civil rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, you may think that these guys, and in many cases, they are in the IRA, they are considered an enemy of the state, so you think it is legitimate to intern them and question them, but you are then hampering their civil rights, and that is what happened.
But it has worked. It did work in 56 to 62, where there was a border campaign by the IRA. Now, I think the problem with that border campaign, from a Republican perspective, was it didn't have massive support, and there was people coming up from the south of Ireland and attacking the odd police station and running away again. It wasn't a massive campaign. It kind of but they rounded up,
and the Irish government interned people as well.
But that was about the point I was going to get. I mean, Republicans say this is a tool of the British state, and how dare they use this, abuse the rule of law and arrest Republicans. De Valera did it. It was done during the Civil War by the Michael Collins' government at the time.
Cosgrave,
Subsequently done by De Valera when he was in Prime Minister as well, wasn't he?
Taoiseach in the Second World War. There was IRA members interned, and then obviously the border campaign. There was different governments, mainly Fianna Fáil governments.
So the Southern government weren't afraid to use internment.
No, they weren't. No, it had been used by the British against the Irish, during the Easter Rising, and then in the War of Independence, and then it was used by the Free State against there was about 13,000 internees, Republican internees and prisoners after the Civil War. The Civil War ended in May 23, but there was 12,000, 13,000 in October, November 23, and 8,000 of them went on hunger strike.
Right.
It was a policy used by different administrations. This is not, solely to preserve the British, but the British did use a lot in colonies like Kenya, for example, in the Mamo uprising. They used internment. So that was where the Northern Ireland government, with the help of the British Army, the British government were looking at in terms of introducing in 71.
It's a blunt instrument, and certainly was in 71.
I
have an auntie who was interned during the Second World War.
I think I've heard the story before.
Have you heard this story before?
I think many people have heard the story before.
Shut up. I had a great auntie, my mother's auntie, Catherine O'Hara.
And who's she? She was
auntie.
She was a graw for someone very famous in the Republican movement.
She was anti-treaty IRA during the Civil War.
And she's a lover of.
Partner was a guy called Joe McKelvey, who was in the Four Courts, which was the instigating incident for the Civil War. He was anti-treaty Republican, was in the Four Courts, was arrested and put in jail, and then
interned
in 1922, December 22, the anti-treaty Republican anti-treaty IRA murdered a TD. Sean Hales.
Yeah.
In retaliation, the Free State government took out 4 Republicans, one from each province, including Joe McKelvey, and executed them out of hand. as a
I know, it was hugely controversial, wasn't it?
hugely controversial,
yeah,
brilliant
yeah.
play about it. Ulick O'Connor's executions, well worth reading if you're looking up. And we're talking about an internment being,
Yeah,
extrajudicial. This was just an
Completely,
extrajudicial
and it was seen. I was
assassination.
seen as such, and even the Free State government admitted it.
Yeah.
It was extrajudicial. Yeah.
So Joe McKelvey's partner was my great auntie.
And you had the
Cassie
uniform.
O'Hara.
You had his uniform, didn't you?
Cassie O'Hara was presented with his IRA uniform, which he kept for about 50 years, and it ended up in our house when I was a young lad. But Cassie would have been fairly die-hard anti-treaty Republican the whole way through.
Yeah.
When the Northern Ireland was created, she was a teacher. She refused to take the oath of allegiance to the...
That was a big issue as well.
The
Yeah,
Northern
back
Ireland government lost her job over the head of that, was still hanging around
So
with...
she never took up teaching. Never.
No, she ended up going to run the wee shop in Castle Street.
She's what? Because most teachers did finally take to oaths because.
Oh no, she was.
jobs.
I mean, nowadays you describe her as a dissident Republican. Literally very hard line.
Yeah.
Still hanging around with IRA elements during the Second World War, and was interned during the Second World War in Armagh and spent most of the war in Armagh jail. In fact, led a hunger strike in Armagh jail as well.
Wow.
So it was used 1916.
Yeah.
By the British, used again by the British during the War of Independence, used by the Republicans, Free State during the Civil War to intern Republicans, used again by the British and the Republicans and the
Irish
Free State government. In the Second World War, used again in 52 to 56,
56,
62. So 71, you kind of go, well, there's a history here. It has worked in the past. This might be.
And was used by Northern government as well, of course, in 22. After T.J. Twaddle, an Ulster Union's MP, is killed.
Twaddell, I think we call him.
Not Twaddle.
No, Twaddell Avenue. You never heard of Twaddell Avenue? What county are you from again? You from Laois?
I'm from. It used to be called Queen's County, I believe.
Mr. Twaddle. No, you never heard of the dispute of Twaddell Avenue.
I know. So there's my pronunciation.
You're going to tell me. Parnell is Parnell next, which I won't have, by the way.
I will. He called himself Parnell.
Well,
I always call Parnell.
Right.
Anyway, that's another story. But yeah, Twaddell sounds better.
Twaddell, yes. Mr. Twaddell was executed in 1922.
No, he was shot in the street. He was going to his outfitter's shop and he was shot dead
by the IRA.
I don't think anyone ever was convicted of that. His killing, but he. But anyway, then the IRA the Northern government had introduced a Special Powers Act, which it kept for its full duration, and they rounded up loads of people. They were all in ships and in different prisons, interned for years. And they actually, some of them were interned until late 25, early 26, until the Boundary Commission settlement in that year.
What?
So
the Boundary Commission?
Yeah.
Wow, this is brilliant. We're 20 minutes in and you took
you
20 minutes to mention the Boundary Commission. It's almost like you've written a book on it or something.
Yeah, we'll talk about it again, I think. But
well, just stick with in terms of slightly more. Just listeners, you're listening to the Irish History Boys with me, Tim McGarry. A-level history, by the way. I got an A in A-level history in 1982. So I'm very impressive. Dr. Cormac Moore. Your doctorate is in history, isn't it? I take it.
Oh, it is. Yeah, I'm no medical. If you're in need of medical help, don't come to
me. That's okay. What specifically did you study?
Actually, the soccer split is my PhD, and how institutions of Ireland adapted to partition.
So, right.
Yeah. So not just the political side, but how the churches, how the sports bodies, how the labour movement, all that, how they actually reacted to partition.
Right. Well, we'll get to that shortly, but we're looking at the Irish News headline from April 1975 and an angry letter from Father Brady condemning the extreme Catholic Mass, anti-Catholic Mass.
And the reason why we're talking about it now is because it's still a big issue. It has to be. Like the British government have been promising, pretty much since they took over direct rule in 72, that it's a temporary measure. They're looking for a political solution. And it's very tough for SDLP as well because they are in a bind. The National Committee is totally against internment. The SDLP is totally against internment, but they are talking to trying to have a power sharing arrangement in place. But they need to deal with internment, and the British government are really stalling the ball here. And they don't get rid of it until December 75.
There's quite a good song, The Men Behind the Wire, if you like that sort of thing. Armoured cars
I was
and
actually-
tanks and guns came to take away our sons, but every man will stand
I
behind.
think, what was it, Alan
You didn't let me sing there, Cormac. I was about to treat
for
the
a reason, Alan Partridge does it better, I think. What was his sidekick called? Martin, was it? From AO.
The Men Behind the Wire. And you think, well, this is ancient history, ladies and gentlemen. It's not, because Gerry Adams might be getting compensation because it came
Keir Starmer is not going to have that.
Keir Starmer is in Parliament within the last month or so saying that he will try to stop Gerry Adams getting compensation because Gerry Adams claims that he was unlawfully interned on a legal technicality that I think I'm right that the Secretary of State should have signed the internment order and it wasn't. It was somebody below the Secretary of State. So basically, somebody recommends to the Secretary of State, you need to arrest Tim McGarry and put him away in jail for
Have
a
they?
while.
It's about time.
Not yet. And he's supposed to judicially, he's the formal powers, and that didn't happen in Gerry's case, and he could be due a lot of compensation.
Well, he did say he's going to give it to some charity, but there will be a lot of internees that could get compensation, but that's a whole different story, So, but it was, look, it was a massive issue. It backfired spectacularly. I think it is fair to say. Yes, they did actually arrest a lot of people that were in the IRA, but the damage it did by actually making new recruits, and even those interned, even though they were off the streets for a number of years, they actually became more indoctrinated into the Republican movement. And mind him got involved in the hunger strikes, 81.
Well, I was going to say that the internment indirectly led to the hunger strikes because internment, at least the people who were arrested, they were given a vague political status, weren't they? Because they were told, well, you're arrested under these special powers, therefore certainly they regarded themselves as political prisoners. But when they ended internment, and when did they finally end internment?
December 75.
December 75. They then took away political status at the same time, isn't that right?
But there was some, there's an incident in March 75 where internees went to the court hearing actually in their underwear, because they were protesting against their treatment as prisoners. So this whole idea, like the treatment of prisoners and how they're treated as a political issue, was there before 76, 77, and then on to 81 and all that.
And the Republican movement has always used this as a very good sort of weapon, a propaganda weapon, and a big stick to beat the Brits with the treatment of prisoners.
And the British admitted that, like, we've just given them the best propaganda tool they could ask for, and that's what they did, and because it didn't work, and it was reviled by not just nationalists, but people like the Alliance Party, for example, which would have been small unionists back in the 70s. They were against internment, and then internationally there was Colonel Gaddafi starts getting interested in the IRA because of internment. That's when he starts hearing about what's going up in the north, and he starts supporting
Gaddafi. A well-known advocate of human rights, of course.
So he starts supporting them from around the time of internment. Paul McCartney even sings, a song after The Men Behind the Wire is big in the charts. Then he has one, Give Ireland Back to the Irish. Paul McCartney, who I wouldn't necessarily have associated with, the Irish nationalism. So
Liverpool. That's
yeah, I don't know. I'm honestly, I just never passed my radar.
Full of Irish people.
33rd county of Ireland and all that. Yeah.
McCartney, Lennon, bound to be Irish, aren't they? we claim everybody.
Yeah.
So that was the story in the Irish News in a letter written in April 1975.
Yeah.
Do you want to move on to your favourite topic in the world?
What's that?
The Boundary Commission of 1925.
Only for this year, Tim. Only this year. While the 100th anniversary of its debacle is at play,
There's a great story in this week in the Irish News 100 years ago, which is where people kind of assume the Boundary Commission is. From a nationalist perspective, they're going to go, right, we're going to cut up bits of Northern Ireland and we're going to give them to the Free State.
Yeah.
But there was a kind of issue where people down south were kind of going, wait a minute, whoa, what if the Boundary Commission says we're going to give bits of the south to the north? Could that be a possibility? And they didn't appear to reckon that was a possibility. And then the Boundary Commission said, well, no, that certainly is a possibility. Bits of the south can go to the north.
It kind of became public in while the Boundary Commission was having its sittings, and the Monaghan County Council realised that places like Glasslough and Mullayash and Dromully were actually looking to be removed from Free State to the north, and they were based in Monaghan, which is in the Free State, and the Monaghan Council, that can't happen. Like, They can't, you can't transfer territory from the Free State to the north. But the treaty doesn't say that you can't transfer territory.
The treaty
only one side or the other, like
just to go back slightly for people who missed the first episode, where the hell were you? Go and get a catch up now. The Treaty of 1921, December 1921. As part of the treaty, Michael Collins says that the boundary between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will be decided by a boundary commission, which will look at the wishes of the local inhabitants, but on condition
it's compatible.
As long as the wishes of the inhabitants are compatible with the geographic and economic conditions.
Yeah.
So that's a big get out clause.
It's so vague. So it's up to the chairman, Richard Feetham, to interpret.
The Boundary Commission eventually meets in 1924.
Yeah.
There's an Irish representative, Owen McNeill. There's a British representative.
The British appointed judge, the chairperson is Judge Richard Feetham.
Right.
He's based in South Africa, but he's actually British. He was born in Britain. Right. And then there's the Northern Ireland representative, who was appointed by the British because Northern Ireland wouldn't appoint their representative,
right.
Joseph R. Fisher. But so they actually, and the Free State government have.
These three commissioners then, they are the Boundary Commission. Their job is to go round, which they did, took a year to go round and ask people about where they wanted to be. They looked at the geographic and economic conditions. They looked at the wishes of the inhabitants, and lots of people on border areas were, meeting these boundary commissioners and going, look, I live in Newry, I want to be in the Free State. Lots
absolutely.
Of unionists in particularly certain areas going, no, we want to stay in Northern
Donegal,
Ireland.
for example, I'm North Monaghan, as mentioned.
We want to stay in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
A lot of people thought there were going to be wholesale large transfers of land, and it turned out not to be the case at all.
No, but obviously we were going to be discussing this more, I think, Tim, by the end of this year. And yes, so look, it was all about how it was interpreted, and Richard Feetham took a very minimalist viewpoint of interpretation, and he also believed that because the Boundary Commission wording in the treaty didn't specifically saying it was only for Northern Territory to be transferred to Free State, he saw it could go both ways. The Free State government thought this that's not the way they interpreted it. They actually interpreted it as the Boundary Commission was a punishment for Northern Ireland not going into the Free State. That's how they interpreted it. So this could only be for Northern Territory going to the Free State. But as I said, it was up to the chairman to decide, essentially. And so he did look at submissions from Donegal, from North Monaghan. And the award they actually offered, which was never published until late
1969.
60s. Yes, it was a book format published in 69, but I think they opened the files in 68 to Geoffrey Hand. And basically parts of North Monaghan were going to be transferred to Northern Ireland, and rich parts of East Donegal were going to be transferred to Northern Ireland as well.
St Johnson, wasn't that right?
Where we've been filming for your series on Long and Short of it, Pettico was going to go to the north, all of it, even though like Pettico now is part of it's in Fermanagh, parts in Donegal, all of it was going to go to the north.
All of it was going to the north.
Yeah, the town. So that's one of the reasons why the Free State government raced over to London to get it shelved, because they did not envisage any territory going to, and they weren't told by Owen McNeill that this could happen. So.
Well, when you look at, this is an episode in history that a lot of people don't know an awful lot about, even people who, like myself, who took an interest, go, what is this Boundary Commission? It was just all sorted out because it was hushed up. The final report of the Boundary Commission was never released. It was leaked to a paper in 1925.
Morning Post, but it wasn't a fully accurate leak, but it was very accurate.
It was close enough.
Close enough.
And the Boundary Commission, which eventually reported, and having taken hundreds and hundreds of submissions and people writing letters and petitions and saying, we'd like to be on this side of the border, we'd like to be on that side of the border, basically tinkered around the edges. There were very, very minor sort of transfers. Not minor if you're involved.
Well, Crossmaglen would have been in the south.
Was that right?
Yeah. So a lot big chunks of South Armagh.
God, I bet they regret that now.
And that could have changed the trajectory of later conflict, So it's that was the big chunk of land was South Armagh. But I suppose the big kind of litmus test, at least for the Irish government, was the Free State government was what about Newry? And Kevin O'Higgins brought this up when he was talking to British government. It's 75% Catholics. And yet none of the South Down was going to Free State, and Newry said it just didn't add up. Obviously Feetham had his own kind of mechanism for deciding, what will be transferred, what would not. it's still hard to reconcile how Newry wasn't, you know. So,
I was out for a lovely walk recently in the Silent Valley.
yeah.
And the Silent Valley Dam was built just before
23. Yeah, so the first saw was
24.
Edward Carson came over from England.
Well, that's why it's relevant to this. I kind of Carson and Craig. This was a major infrastructure project from the Northern Ireland government saying we're going to supply water to Belfast, basically, effectively.
Yeah.
But it was also a sort of laying down a card saying we're here to stay. And it was one of those things that if you have the Silent Valley, I mean, you couldn't possibly give South down
But
to
that's
the Free State, could you? Having built this wonderful piece of infrastructure, could you?
No, but that was one of the. So there was another problem with Feetham's interpretation, that he interpreted conditions as they were in 24-25, not as they were when the treaty was signed in 21. So that damaged the Nash's case as well. So in the meantime, the Northern government was actually building the infrastructure, making those areas around the border more secure. So it was, and Silent Valley was specific. This is a very political decision. Yeah, yes, it was actually used to supply water to Belfast. Just grew so much in the 19th century. Like it became the tiny city in the start of the 19th century to be the biggest city in Ireland, bigger than Dublin by the 1901 census. So they needed, but they ran out of water, and they needed areas to supply water. And Silent Valley was the perfect location. So to be fair, Silent Valley project was long in the making. It wasn't
right. So it wasn't just invented.
Yeah, well, it didn't start in 23.
Yes,
you know, this has been a project that was considered from the 1880s onwards.
But it was very useful.
But yeah, so they decided to push the button on was construction in 23 because of the Boundary Commission. And in fact, the Belfast Water Commissioners appeared before the Boundary Commission and said, you can't have any of down in Free State because we're going to be attacked by, Republicans there. You know, we want the Northern government to have control of this area. It's supplying a huge area of a huge block of people with water.
So South Down, Uri, Restrever, roll around there. That was going to stay no matter what because of Silent Valley. Is that partly because?
Well, Newry was still seen as very important strategically for Northern Ireland. So there's a lot of reasons, and again it was coming back to the unionists were saying, well, yeah, there may be 75% nationalists, Catholics, but we pay more rates, so we just have a bigger say.
Well, that's quite right.
That does come up a lot. In a lot of the unionist dispositions, they talk about we're paying more. We're entitled to a bigger say. We've the best land. We're entitled to more of a say. We're permanent residents. So this comes up a lot. So the unionists focus when they're talking to the Boundary Commission, they focus mainly on economics and geographic conditions, but they sometimes dip into the whole. Wishes of the inhabitants, which is the Nash's trump card in most areas, but those figures are known anyway. They're
nationalists. I mean, from a nationalist perspective, they would say, look, the 6 counties is just a sectarian state. It's based on a sectarian head count.
Well, it was.
Up to an extent, because the unionists didn't want. Could have had if they wanted the whole 9 counties of Ulster.
They could have called them Ulster then, legitimately,
rather than the occupied 6 county statelet. I mean, so they could have called it. They were offered 9 counties, didn't want 9 counties.
They didn't want it because it would have been 55% Protestant, 45% Catholic. That could have swung away from them very quickly. So they wanted a secure citadel, a permanent majority, basically,
right?
And
would 4 counties not have given them a permanent?
Yeah, but it just seems too small, and Tyrone and Fermanagh were seen as important territories as well.
Because there were there weren't a majority, there weren't unionist majorities in Fermanagh and Tyrone, but there were substantial minorities of unionists, so very substantial minorities.
Both counties had about 55% Catholics, 45% Protestants, but then Armagh had even, I think, had 47% Catholics and 53% Protestants, but no one ever talked about Armagh. That in terms of as a county block, it's always Tyrone and Fermanagh. Armagh was never in the equation, even though it had a smaller Protestant majority than Tyrone and Fermanagh had Catholic majority. Right. And same with Derry City. Derry City had a bigger Catholic majority than Armagh had a Protestant majority. But it was so
Derry City was never going to go into the south, was it?
Well, based on the wishes of the inhabitants, it would have, but it did. That's why the nationalists, even in late 25, when the by this stage the Boundary Commission has already pretty much decided what its award is going to be. You've got opposition leaders like Thomas Johnson in the Labour Party. He's the official leader of the opposition in Free State. He's saying there needs to be a plebiscite, and that's what nationalists want. Was a plebiscite because it would give kind
So
of
a local referendum saying which side of the border do you want to be on?
yeah, exactly, yeah, and Feetham refused to do that because he was actually advised by the British government that it would be very messy. You could have violence. You could have there's the specials weren't reliable. There was a lot of very hardline unionists that could have started violence if you tried to introduce a plebiscite in those areas. And it was very messy. So decided, look, and if you don't do a plebiscite, say you're going to do it because of violence, then the Free State can say legitimately, well, this is a sham. You've broken the treaty basically. You've breached the treaty.
So the lesson of the whole thing is that you need to have a lawyer because there aren't enough lawyers in the world. But basically, Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith.
Well, actually,
the interpretation of Article 12 was
but they weren't lawyers. To be fair to them, but they had a lot of lawyers with them. But Thomas Jones, he was a Welsh advisor to the British government. He was very good friends with David Lloyd George. In fact, the two of them used to speak Welsh to each other a lot. It's a good tactic as well to hide what they're saying to people. But he was saying it's amazing how there was a list of a list of who's who of great lawyers involved on the British side, even on the Irish side. It's amazing how a great lawyer can't even do their own will, basically. So there was a bit of case of that with the treaty, the documentation. It was just so ambiguous. It was so vague. The language, it suited the British perfectly because they could use and they did
and
use
they
it.
put a lot of pressure on Michael Collins. Basically saying now, "Are we unleash war?" And he goes, "Yeah, okay. Well, I'm sure we'll kick this can down the road. I mean, Ulster, we don't worry about it. We'll put it down the road. We've got bigger things to worry about than the 6 counties or the north at this time." Is that?
Well, they definitely wanted to kick the can down the road because unionists wanted nothing to do with Dublin and Sinn Féin wanted United Ireland. So how do you get those two to meet? And the Boundary Commission was the solution, and it was a case of kicking it down the road. So it was a big mistake by Sinn Féin agreeing to have vague wordings, and it came back to bite him so many times in subsequent years.
Yeah, including up to today.
Exactly.
Here, let's go into something light. I like things in the Irish news from April 11th, 1925. The failure of prohibition to prohibit. As a man who likes the odd pint of Guinness, I have to say this is a story that caught my eye. This is the sale of bootleg liquid in New York has now reached the point of development where formal price lists are issued at regular intervals to customers, says the New York correspondent of the Evening Standard. So the Americans introduced prohibition, banned alcohol across the entire United States, and it doesn't appear to be working very well, does it?
Imagine that you can have a list. You get a list and get whatever drink you want. So it's not, is it really prohibited? It's a good question.
The most expensive item on the list is Cliquot Yellow Label Champagne, a bit of Veuve Clicquot 1919 vintage.
And the cheapest, Gordon's Gin. It still is one of the cheaper gin brands, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, well, prohibition was always a bad idea, wasn't it? I mean, so basically they're saying that prohibition, when was prohibition introduced? It was a year or so earlier than that.
Yeah, it's right. Early 20s, isn't it? Early 21, 22. I actually don't know the full.
So ineffective was the enforcement of prohibition that bootleggers were openly publishing alcohol price lists. I have a slight claim to fame about Canada. I have relatives. I did a DNA test, and distant relatives of mine were living in Canada in 1914. And 2 brothers called McClelland, John and Tom. One of them got absolutely hammered in a pub. Drove his horse and cart home, was so drunk that he fell asleep and froze to death. Right?
Wow.
This is true.
Whereabouts in Canada?
This is in Ontario. I can't remember. His brother then was supposed to go to his funeral, right? He got so drunk he got in a fight with the police and ended up in jail and missed his own brother's funeral. The reason I tell you this story is because this story of the McClelland brothers became so notorious, it was taken up by the temperance movement of Canada as an argument to introduce prohibition in Canada. And this was one of their big cases today, that McClelland brothers, look at what drunkenness does for you. And 4 years later, in 1918, prohibition was introduced in Canada. thanks to my relatives. That's
I actually didn't know that prohibition
know
was in
that?
Canada. You know, poor Canada. I know we're hearing a lot about Canada now with an Irish Prime Minister. You know,
Yes.
Mark Carney. But yeah, I actually did not know that Canada.
You did not know that. You see?
I definitely did not know that you had relatives that started the
Thanks to my relatives. Yeah,
Your
But,
ancestors. Yeah.
I don't know how long it lasted in Canada. If anybody does know how long it lasted, you can feel free to contact us, the Irish History Boys, myself, Tim McGarry, and Cormac Moore, on 07483 313 842. That's our WhatsApp number if you'd like any comments or you'd like us to cover any particular topic. We're very keen on alcohol, covering alcohol. Prohibition is never a good idea, is it? It's not going to work.
It doesn't work, you know. It's just going to go underground, and
Yeah.
people are going to find drink. Ultimately, if you want drink, you'll find it. And if you were in the States back in in 25, you could get a list of how much it costs and delivered to your door. So was it really prohibited?
No. Well, there's a slightly serious argument there about drugs as well. And people say,
Yeah,
well,
of course,
what's the
yeah,
point?
yeah.
What's the point
Yeah.
of
You'd actually
prohibiting?
drive the underground, overground. It'll be. It'll be
Yeah.
better. It'll be better health measures there.
I suspect
safer.
I know that drugs are illegal. I suspect I could probably get a list of the sale of drugs in Belfast for whatever drug I wanted to, and with very little difficulty.
I wouldn't know where to start.
Oh, you're from Laois, you wouldn't know anything.
It's a bit harsh.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Irish History Boys. Thank you very much for listening. Join us again. I'm Tim McGarry, and my very good friend and colleague,
Dr. Cormac Moore.
Dr. Cormac Moore.
I actually said, you should have said Dr. Cormac Moore. I'm not a medical doctor.
You called yourself doctor there.
Because you've been saying it the last couple of episodes.
You're too humble. I didn't boast about my A level, but you boasted about your doctorate.
I think you have, didn't you? You got an A.
I got an A. Thank you very much. We'll see you again on the Irish History Boys.
See you next time.